Welcome to the Streets and People podcast, where we explore having more transport options that are less hassle to use. Hosted by Around Caboolture, we bring you 3 types of episodes. People and Projects share stories of change. Not Everyone Drives gives voice to non-drivers. Road Rules 360 unpacks road rules for people outside a car. Music by Grand Project, and let's make our Grand Project reimagining streets made for people. Today we're doing one of our People and Projects episodes, and I am delighted to be in the studio here with Russell King. I know Russell because we do the book club together, and also I know you from the Transport Leader newsletter and blog. I'm here on Gubbi Gubbi country in Queensland in Caboolture. And Russell, whereabouts are you calling from, and what made you interested in this whole area of transport?
I'm in northwest Sydney. In terms of how did I get into transport, I have a slightly unusual direction of travel to get me to where I've got to. I was elected as a councillor in a London borough back in 2006. And after a few years of being on the council, I got appointed to work on the Transport and Strategic Planning Committee. And then I became the cabinet member for Transport and Strategic Planning. And I think it's fair to say that I was going up a steep learning curve in terms of understanding all of the intricacies around transport. So I recently wrote a blog, for example, about why generalists are not great at leading transport. And although politicians are in a slightly different space because they're supposed to get expert advice from people who are experts in transport, you're still trying to get your head around a whole bunch of things that are counterintuitive, like induced demand. You mean if I build more roads, that congestion will get worse? That's just not instinctive for the vast majority of people. I did a whole bunch of interesting stuff while I was in Wandsworth. We were rolling out the bike share scheme in London locally. We were doing cycle superhighways. We were transforming our town centres to make them more walkable. We were doing a whole bunch of stuff in the regeneration of the Nine Elms Battersea Power Station area. So we were helping to get the Northern Line extension up and running, which opened a few years ago. So there's a whole bunch of really interesting stuff that I did there. And then, as you do in London, I met an Australian girl who ended up getting an amazing job back in Australia. And so we got married and I ended up coming over to Australia, where because of my political background, I ended up helping with the New South Wales state election back in, I think, 2014, 2015. And then because of my background in transport as well, I ended up advising the Minister for Transport and Infrastructure in New South Wales. And it was a very interesting time because the Liberal Party had gone to the election promising to lease the poles and wires of the electricity grid in New South Wales, and that transaction was going to deliver about $20 billion, the vast majority of which was going to go into transport infrastructure. So I'm sitting there as the policy director for a minister who is cashed up to spend money. And at the time, Sydney had had a dearth of investment in infrastructure for a couple of decades, and very much the government of the day was looking to catch that up. And so there was a lot of all sorts of transport projects that we went through. 3 light rail projects. We're looking at several metro projects, new trains, upgrades to rail lines. There was a whole bunch of stuff that we did. We also did some significant policy reforms. So Uber had only just come in when I was there, and we did some policy reform for incorporate Uber into the system. We also did fare reforms and got rid of free fares without any political challenges at all, which I think is very impressive by most people's standards. So yeah, it was a great time. And then I've been in the transport and land use and policy space pretty much ever since. And then I was in government recently, heading up a policy in a government agency which was being restructured by the New South Wales government. And as part of that, my role disappeared. And so I had to decide what I wanted to do next. And one of the things that I've wanted to do for quite a while is to help transform transport systems around the world, and helping transport experts to sort of understand what's going on around the world and use that to inspire transformation in transport, to deliver better transport systems. And so I started the Transport Leader blog and podcast for transport leaders, for people like yourself who are leading the discussion on how we can transform our transport systems and deliver much better outcomes for our communities.
You know, it's an unusual one, as you say, because it's got this political experience. And most people either come from a community background like me, or they've got an engineering background or some kind of transport planning, or a master's in urbanism or something like that. So to have that practical, political, strategic background, it's fantastic to have you on the show because it's all about the politics. This is what I've come to after 3 years of Get Around Culture. It's all around the politics.
I agree with you that politics is a really critical factor, but I also think we have a lot of work to get our own house in order in terms of transport experts as well. Politics is not the only challenge. Politicians rely on high quality advice, and often the advice that I've seen being given is not great.
Oh, well, I feel already people in transport land, our listener might suddenly blow up or something. These are all Russell's ideas and thoughts. It's nothing to do with me. Don't write me any hate mail.
That's right. I get plenty of hate mail from my blog and newsletter. No, I don't. But people know that I write often stuff that they wish they could say, but for whatever reason, they're not allowed to say it. So I get a lot of people saying, Russell, can you say this because it needs to be said, but I can't say it because it will damage my career or whatever. And I'm like, happy to say that because it's some of these home truths need to be told.
Yeah, I think that is certainly a real asset with your newsletter. I really enjoy it. I don't always agree with everything you say, but I always like the question. So for me, so much about transport is what is possible and how could we do this and rethinking this, because whatever we've been doing for the last 70 years isn't working. So I love the fact that you're asking the question. What we're doing isn't working. Let's try something different. Normally we don't go into politics because too many people get offside with that. But you have a conservative background. You've worked for a political party. And what I see a lot in transport land as a community group, and I've had it from people all over, is that I ride a bicycle and I have a community group. So people automatically assume that it's all about being better for the environment. And I keep saying it's not that. You'll just be financially a whole lot better off. And it doesn't matter whether you're council, state, federal, or a local community member, you're going to be a heap better off financially. It's really hard to get that message across. So I thought, given that the focus so often is on a progressive left agenda, because you've got a conservative approach, I thought that would be great for you to share your ideas on the podcast.
I think one of the things that I find uncomfortable at the moment is, I'm a great advocate for public and active transport. And one of the things I hear quite a lot from people who consider themselves to be of the left is that these are progressive policies and that people who support active and public transport are progressive policies. And I actually really disagree with that, and I think it's really problematic as well. So the reason I disagree with it, and I recently wrote a blog on this, was there's all sorts of good reasons why they help with conservative values, active and public transport. But the other reason it's really problematic is transport is not a game where you want to be changing policies every few years based on which colour or political party is in power. So for example, I kicked off the initial conversation on a project that won't be delivered until 2032. I had that first conversation in 2016. Okay, it's a big metro project being built in Sydney. Now, if you're talking about a project that's going to take effectively from the very first conversation to actually being open 16 years, you don't want to have a situation where that project gets, approved, cancelled, reapproved. That would be a disaster. And so what we want to have is much more consistency. And actually, when you look at things like active transport and public transport, whether you have the values of the left or the right, I actually believe that it supports both of those perspectives. And so we should have much more consensus, and people who try to own active or public transport for one political side or the other are actually undermining consensus driving on transport to the detriment of both sides.
So let's step through the conservative. So I have 3 politicians in my local area, one for each tier of government. One is far right, libertarian, one is medium right, and one is left. And then we also have the Greens. So tell me, how should I approach the conservative politicians with the ideas for better active and public transport?
Yeah, so one of the false narratives that we see, and I actually think this is reinforced by progressives as well, is that public transport is subsidised and cars are not. And it's not true. When you actually look at the holistic funding of cars, they are heavily subsidised in a whole bunch of ways. So typically fuel taxes, gas taxes, whatever you want to call them, and regos, they don't cover the cost of maintaining and building the roads. So there's a whole bunch of government subsidy going into building and maintaining the roads to start with. Then you've got things like health outcomes. So the more cars you have, the more accidents you tend to have, more driving. And then that creates a whole bunch of costs on the emergency services, police, fire, ambulance, health system. Also, car dependency creates huge amounts of negative health outcomes, whether that's in things like obesity or mental health. And the result is that creates huge amounts of costs on public healthcare systems. So it's a false narrative that public and active transport require government subsidies and cars do not. If you want to have small government, actually a well-run public and active transport system is actually central to getting a good outcome in terms of reducing your costs to government. So if you're, for example, take somebody who is currently driving their car and you put them on a bicycle in their active transport lane, you just suddenly reduce a whole bunch of maintenance costs from what the car costs on the roads. Costs from one person cycling on a cycle lane are negligible. But as somebody who is driving a heavy, even an electric vehicle, which is a very heavy SUV, significant maintenance implications, right, over time. So you're saving money by actually doing active and public transport. I think one of the things that I hear, and I don't agree with this, is that public transport should be used as a public service. It should be free and accessible, etc. And I actually think that's really dangerous. I think that's really problematic, because what you end up with then is a system that is starved of investment. And one of the things we need to be doing is investing more in our public transport systems. And people find good ways of getting good fare box recovery while also providing decent equity outcomes on their public transport systems in other ways other than just giving free or cheap fares for everybody. So that's the smaller government argument. I'll start with that one.
So that one there, I guess I'm always a little bit sus on that argument, because I think cars get a lot of subsidies. I mean, a horrific amount of subsidies. You've got 3 tiers of government that are paying for cars and roads, whereas you've only got the state for public transport and you've only got council for active transport, basically. That's roughly it, which just shows you the price differential on how much cars are. So we don't get much investment from cars because they're only a cost. There's a little bit that comes back in terms of petrol and fuel excise and rego, but very small amounts. So I want to tease out a little bit more of that argument, because to me, cars are so heavily subsidised. I can't see why you can't say buses and trains and trams should also be very heavily subsidised.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons that we have to subsidise public transport is because we subsidise the roads, right? Because we give people free roads, effectively, and free parking. And if you give people stuff for free, well, inevitably they're going to choose that option. Once they've filled up their car, they've purchased their car already, they've already paid for the fuel, a trip doesn't really cost them that much, whereas they feel the pain of paying a fare up front on public transport. So you've got an unbalanced dynamic there in terms of the actual costs that people are paying, which favours cars. The other thing we haven't mentioned is parking. You know, the amount of government land that is allocated towards parking, and often free parking, that's huge assets that are not delivering economic returns and are actually a taxpayer drain in terms of maintenance and looking after those car parks. So that's another huge subsidy in that space. That subsidy also impacts a whole bunch of things. So if you have to have shops that then have to have their own parking because you have got parking minimums on them, that raises the cost of goods in the shops, and people who even don't drive have to pay that cost for car drivers. Housing's the same. If you have parking minimums on housing, people have to pay for that additional land that's providing the parking, even if they don't want to have a car. So you've got a whole bunch of things that are making things worse if you end up with parking requirements and free roads rather than providing a proper charging system for them.
And also the space outside your house. Usually there's a whole lane of roads that are outside there, which is, I think, free parking, because if we had housing that went further up to the curb, then you would need that space for walking.
And what's interesting is, I think, in places where the housing hasn't been built to provide cars and provide spaces for cars, the parking on that street is heavily contested. And the way that people typically manage that is that they charge for parking, okay, to manage and reduce the parking demand. And the reason that doesn't happen very successfully in a lot of outer suburbs of Australia is because the car spaces are on people's drives, etc. And so there isn't enough demand to justify putting pricing on the roads on there. But it does come at the expense of active transport and bike lanes.
Also, just such a huge financial burden to maintain the roads. It's just enormous.
There's a lot of things that councils could spend that money on in a much more productive way.
Yeah, my understanding is it's about half of their income goes on road building.
Which is a frightening proportion.
You know, that just seems like throwing good money after bad to me. Okay, so we've touched on subsidies and parking. When I go to my Conservative politicians, what else should I talk about?
Less congestion. I'll give you an example of a policy. One of the things that we've been going backwards in for decades now, in Australia but around the world, is on the proportion of children that walk or cycle to school. And in other countries, they're doing things called school streets, where the streets outside of a school are effectively car-free during the opening of the school and the closing of the school at the end of the day. And what that's doing is encouraging parents to get their children to walk or cycle to school. And that's very effective, very cheap, and it significantly reduces the number of cars going in at that peak time into schools. And what that shows is that congestion in the local area drops significantly as a result of taking those cars off the road. It doesn't cost much, but it reduces congestion because you're taking people out of cars and putting them into walking and cycling. And it also creates a culture of healthy activity for the children, gets them ready for the day, which is much better for their education, and encourages also people to understand why having good walking paths and cycle paths are really important in their local area. So I think all of that's a really positive policy that the Conservatives should be approaching and championing. And by the way, it's really popular with parents as well. So if you ask most parents, would they like to be able their children to walk or cycle to school? The answer in many, many cases is yes, we would like that to happen. But they just don't feel safe on there. So if you combine school streets and then things like walking and cycling buses so that somebody coordinates walking a whole group of children or cycling with a whole group of children to school, then parents also don't have to necessarily drop off their kids themselves. Saves parents time, enables them to do other things. There's lots of positives by promoting those policies.
I hear all that and I go, yeah, but they also have to appeal to the libertarian voice. That's a big part of Conservative governments today is the libertarian voice. So how to appeal to that side of the community?
Yeah, so one of the things here is, of course, car adverts show how much freedom you get from the cars, nice open roads, go anywhere, go everywhere, etc. That's fine. What happens if you don't want to drive a car? And then if you're a libertarian, you want to give people choice and freedom to make their choices. And unfortunately, the way that we often build our car infrastructure is we exclude people from being able to make alternative choices, whether that's walking or cycling or even public transport, actually. So one of the things here is about giving people genuine choice. There's no choice for people who live in an area where the only option for them is to drive. And especially if you're on a low income, thousands and thousands of dollars every year you have to pay for a car. That is sucking money out of their pockets because they don't have a choice. So libertarians' instincts, right, in terms of providing people with choice and freedom to choose, great. Let them choose not to have a car because it will save them an absolute fortune, improves their health, improves their well-being. There's a whole bunch of benefits from that. Libertarians should be in favour of giving people choice.
Yeah, and I think if you want small government, you want people not to be unemployed. And if the big problem with getting to a job is that there is no alternative, creating the means for people to feel safely to be able to get to work, which is what anybody wants, safely and easily and comfortably, to me that sounds like you would want people to be off unemployment benefits. You would want people to take the initiative to be able to get to an interview and a job easily.
There's a whole bunch of things in that space where the right transport options enable people to be able to live better lives. Even if they can't drive for whatever reason, perhaps they have a particular health condition which means they can't drive, and so they need alternatives. Okay, it's not right that they should be forced to say, well, you have to be able to drive, but I can't drive for medical reasons, then what? Right? It's not fair on those people at all. And if we had better public transport or active transport options, then they will have alternatives to be able to go and work and make their own way. I think there's lots of reasons why in that space that Conservatives should be championing options rather than trapping people in car dependency.
Yeah, so if I've understood correctly, what you're saying is that in many ways what we're not doing with cars is saying this is user pays sufficiently.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's happening at the moment, certainly in Australia, New Zealand as well, and other countries around the world, is there's a debate about road user charging and whether we should be moving to that sort of system. It's controversial for all sorts of reasons. People like free stuff. It's hard to give up free roads. Even though they're not really free, they're just subsidised and hidden costs elsewhere. But that's an interesting discussion because once you put in road user charging or congestion charges, what you see is a significant reduction in traffic. You see more people choosing alternative options like public transport, which enables you then to actually have a healthier relationship between cost recovery on the public transport system, which you can then invest in better public transport services, which then encourages more people to use public transport, and you get into a nice virtual cycle as well. But ending the subsidies for cars through things like road user charging is a precondition to do that.
Okay, so we're at the point in the show where I'm going to give you two people in the community. One is somebody on a disability. One of our big supporters is a guy, he is such a listener and he has a lot of health issues and he has no money and he has housing insecurity. The other one is a stay-at-home mum with 2 kids. One's just in kindergarten, the other one's at home a lot, and the husband is currently not working because of some health issues that he has through his workplace. So she's flat chat. All right, now give me some things that both of these people can do.
I think when you're going to go and talk to your Conservative representatives or centre-right representatives, you want to go and talk to them on their terms about the things where their values are. If you go and talk to them about things that are not their values, they're going to switch off, they're not going to be interested. Far too much of the discussion on public and active transport and providing people with those options is they do it from a centre-left progressive values argument, and that doesn't mean the Conservatives are going to dismiss it. But if you can go there and talk to them about how this will benefit based on their values, how the current system is costing governments a huge amounts of money and taxpayers a lot of money to run the existing system, and we need to reduce that will help. Going about reducing congestion and how these alternatives will help reduce congestion properly. We didn't touch on economic growth, but actually once you get to a certain point, there is really good evidence now, and it's increasing, that productivity in a lot of places is driven not by more investment in roads, but more investment in public and active transport as well, especially in our cities. And then, of course, if you're talking to a libertarian, say, why should I be car dependent? Why are you taking away my freedom? Why are you not giving me options so that I can live a good life? Why is government telling me how I should live my life by forcing me into a car? That's not right. If you're a libertarian and you frame it in that way, they should be upset, actually, about what government is doing to people in terms of creating car dependency. There's also another aspect we haven't covered, which is around vibrant town centres and local communities and businesses. I know that you're very passionate about your local town centre and improving that. We're seeing a lot of town centres that are really struggling. We've had economic changes in things like home deliveries and online shopping, etc. We've had COVID, which hit a lot of local town centres hard as well. But the thing you're finding is that the ones that really thrive, local town centres, they make it a really welcoming place where people want to stay and dwell. They're not noisy, they're not polluted. People don't have to drive around for hours trying to find car park spaces because they walk or they cycle to the places, they get public transport there. Where there is parking, it's properly priced. So there's always spaces available for those people that have to drive. We really need to be rethinking our town centres in terms of making them much more appealing for people to visit and stay and linger as well. And those are strong Conservative values, supporting local businesses and local communities. All of those things really are good things that you can go and talk to your local Conservative politicians depending on your local circumstances and your local context.
Yeah, and something that I was told very early on is to find out the portfolio of the politician, because then they can respond directly to the portfolio. What do you think of that?
There are so many connections in transport on different portfolios. So if they've got the health portfolio, there's massive benefits from active transport. And even public transport is far more healthy as people walk to bus stops and walk to stations than if they just drive a car. And that's just on the physical activity. There's also mental health benefits as well. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can talk to people in the health space, the environment, some of the environmental benefits, reduced pollution, ability to stop building roads and knocking down trees and grasslands and whatever other environmental areas we're knocking down in order to put more concrete on. So there's a whole bunch of stuff there in the environmental space. If they've got the Treasury portfolio and they're worried about expenditure, it's not an efficient use of spend. Go and get your proper analysis done on how much you're spending on roads and parking, and opportunity cost that you've got as a result of policies that you're giving away for free. Most transport agencies have a massive backlog on their roads as they deteriorate on their maintenance because they just don't have enough money to do it. There's a whole bunch of liabilities that governments are building up on the roads space. You can talk to treasurers about that. Whichever portfolio, there's probably something in there. If you're interested in vibrant communities and vibrant businesses, people prefer cities with great public transport and active transport to visit for tourism, but they also prefer it to live. If you're trying to attract people to come and live in your area, into your city, having great transport options is a really important aspect of that sort of package for people.
Yeah, I mean, I've lived in different places in Europe and also interstate, and I find that I like having the option to sort of get on and get off. Yes, it's a bit of a hassle sometimes with carrying things, but there's something about not feeling like you're in a cage as you go everywhere, which feels quite liberating for me. That's the thing that appeals to me so much.
One of the things you see in the narrative in the transport space at the moment is people often live in car-dependent places, but the places they choose to go on holiday, presumably where they love being, because that's why they're going on holiday, are the exact opposite. They're places where they're walkable and where they can get on public transport to go around, where they can cycle easily, and the places are quiet and friendly and not polluted. They're the exact opposite of car-dependent cities, and that's where people choose to spend a significant amount of their time. The world's most popular tourist destinations, places like Paris, increasingly walkable, increasingly cycle-friendly now. It's doing great for them.
Caboolture is very, very car dependent, and the thing about living here is I know no one is ever going to be a tourist here because it's so unappealing in many ways. It's car dependent, and you don't come here unless you're visiting a relative or a friend. That's just the truth of it. It's sad to say, but I feel that there's a huge amount of lost revenue because of that, and lost opportunity and all sorts of different things.
Yeah, and the thing is, there's nothing from stopping a community creating a really healthy and vibrant town centre that people want to come to from miles away. If you create a place that's really nice to be at, you'll attract businesses that want to open up stores there, and you'll attract people from very large distances away. We'll get on public transport and visit the town centre and make it a vibrant place. Those are things that you can do without having, the natural bestowments of a beach or needing to build your own Eiffel Tower or Arc de Triomphe to get people to come. There are things we can do, but we sometimes lack imagination.
Yeah, I mean, Caboolture's got a great river, and you can go kayaking on there actually, and it's absolutely gorgeous.
Fantastic.
I sit there going, why doesn't council make the most of that? That just strikes me as being an absolute goldmine for opportunity, and I don't really understand that.
I had a conversation with someone in the UK who's very big into the cycling community in the UK and looking at cycle lanes and using the canals, and you said, it's a no-brainer just to clean up the paths on the canals. They're more walkable and cyclable. It's really about good lighting and good maintenance. It's a great asset, but the councils are not maintaining them well, so very disappointing he was. But yeah, good opportunities, right? Councils need to be thinking about these things. When I was a councillor, so Wandsworth is named after the River Wandle, which runs through the borough. And the River Wandle was one of those places that became almost a hidden river. It wasn't built over like a lot of rivers were in London, but it was kind of hidden away behind sort of industrial buildings and those sorts of things. And we had a long-term policy that every time there was a sort of regeneration, they had to open up the pathway to the river. And so there's a lot of stuff around cleaning up the river and also making it very accessible to people. So there's walking paths, etc. down there. And that was a long-term strategy for the council because it's a great asset that was hidden away. We were making good progress. I don't know how they're doing now. I should probably go and visit sometime soon.
I think Caboolture River sounds very similar to Wandle River. That sounds a perfect correlation. So now we're at the point in the show where I say, okay, so if someone's at the bottom of the food chain at council, right at the top of the tree, it's all, we have to build more roads. The state really wants to duplicate all the roads, and I don't feel like I have any power in any say of anything. I would love to see more, but those at the top of the food chain, they just want more lanes because they want to make the residents happy.
I would start by trying to build alliances with people in the council that share your views on it. Go and talk to people about, are we just thinking too car-brained here? What are we thinking about in terms of community transport and active transport and public transport, etc.? And build a group of people who all think the same thing. Because people at the bottom of the food chain, they typically over time will go up that food chain, and that moves. And I think we're actually seeing that change in dynamic actually in transport more generally. So I think there's a divide, and I'll put people in the over 50s. I've just hit over 50 now, so I'll put myself in the negative category. But I think over 50 traffic engineers had a certain training about throughput for roads, and that was their orientation. The new traffic engineers are much more multimodal thinking and holistic thinking and understand concepts like induced demand and how if you make the road better, you just attract more people to drive down it. So I think there's a very different school of thought that's coming through, and I hope that will help us transform our transport systems moving forward.
Yeah, I feel there's a very clear cultural difference between the under 45s and the over 50s, and I'm in my late 50s, so I can say that. There is something just generally that is on a range of issues, actually. I want to say a bit less selfish. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's my vibe. I have great hope in people who are under 45 to rescue the calamity that those of us who are over 50 have created. That's my hope.
It's difficult for people who are in their late 50s, perhaps, who have been supporting policies their entire life, except that there are different arguments where they may be making choices that are not the greatest and moving forward. And I think part of that is also Australia growing up So there's a big generational divide in Australian cities, you find as well. So in Sydney, when we were building a lot of public transport, and people were like, oh, but why can't I just continue to drive in Sydney? It was always easy to drive around Sydney and get to the beaches, etc. And now it's really crowded. And it's just like, we're now a global city. Sydney's a massive city, as is Melbourne. Places like Brisbane are growing very fast as well. You have to change how you do your transport systems. And I think one of the failures that Australia has had is it's been reluctant to let go of its car-based model in its cities and appropriately shift to more focus on active and public transport. And that's why cities like Melbourne and Sydney are getting continually more congested, because they're not thinking about how to get people moving around the city, and they're still stuck in the answer to our problem is to build more roads.
I watched a video with Rob Stokes, and he said most of Australia increased its population with suburbia. And so the sort of cities have come from that model. So we're sort of changing the landscape, the urban-suburban landscape, very substantially.
Yeah, and Rob's very wise in that space. As a former Minister for Transport in New South Wales, he was doing a lot of forward thinking about how we do those changes and how we take people with us.
So we're up to the last question, which is any final thoughts, anything you wish I had asked that I didn't, anything else you would like to share that it would just be helpful for our listener?
You've done an amazing job, as always. I'm a big avid listener, so I'm enjoying being on the podcast as well as listening to the podcast. The only thing I would probably say is, if you like where I'm coming from, please subscribe to my newsletter. I'm sure Wendy will put it in the description, and I'd love to have you as a reader.
Absolutely. And I would have to say, we've been doing the book club for a little while here, and I've really enjoyed working with you. So there's a bit of a fan on this side of the counter. So I really appreciated your guidance and support and help. Yeah, it's been fantastic to collaborate with you.
Likewise, I would say exactly the same thing back to you as well.
All right, fantastic. Well, we'll wrap it up there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you for listening to the Streets and People podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with someone who'd find it helpful. Your small action could make a big difference. We're on all the usual podcasting platforms, so don't miss a single story. To find out what else we do, check out Around Caboolture.au. Until next time, remember, there's more than one way to get where you're going. Keep moving, keep listening, and keep imagining streets made for people.